Buenos días. Good morning. Vamos a dar comienzo a la sesión inaugural de la Mesa Redonda de Derecho Constitucional organizada por la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional. Agradecemos en este acto la presencia del señor decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, el doctor Guillermo Barrera Buteler, de la señora decana de la Facultad de Ciencia Política y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Católica de Córdoba, la doctora Mónica Cingolani, de los señores legisladores provinciales, Dante Rossi, Marisa Carrillo, Matías Chamorro, de la señora diputada nacional, Brenda Austin, del señor vocal de Cámara Federal de Córdoba, el doctor Eduardo Ábalos, de la señora directora del Centro de Investigaciones Jurídicas, la doctora Alejandra Estica, estimados profesores, expositores, estudiantes y público en general. Asimismo, agradecemos las salutaciones recibidas de parte de quienes por diversos motivos no han podido hacerse presente en este acto. Entre ellos, destacamos especialmente las palabras remitidas por el señor rector de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, el doctor John Boreto.
Como rector de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, quiero agradecer la invitación que me hicieran llegar para participar de esta mesa redonda de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional y enviar un cálido saludo a los organizadores. Paolo Riveri, miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional, doctor Guillermo Barrera Buteler, decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, y doctora Mónica Cingolani, decana de la Facultad de Ciencia Política de la Universidad Católica de Córdoba. Política, Sentimental and Memorial Emotion in Constitutional Law es el tema que convoca y que resulta especialmente relevante hoy en nuestro país y en toda América Latina. Celebro que especialistas de la Argentina y de distintos lugares del mundo se reúnan en este espacio de debate e intercambio, que constituye además un hecho de relevancia académica e internacional para nuestra universidad. Deseo tengan un fructífero encuentro y que producto de las conversaciones puedan surgir conclusiones que alumbren respuestas para los enormes desafíos y dilemas que tiene nuestro país. Cordialmente, John Boreto.
Asimismo, nos ha hecho llegar sus salutaciones el señor ex vicerrector de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, profesor doctor Ramón Pedro Yancy Ferreira.
Aprovecho la oportunidad para agradecerles y hacerles llegar, como así también, mis sinceras felicitaciones extensivas a los demás integrantes de la comisión organizadora por la realización de este importante evento internacional que cuenta con la declaración de interés y adhesión por parte de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. En esta ocasión, el eje convocante consiste en emociones políticas y sentimientos constitucionales, que constituye un espacio de profunda reflexión y análisis, abordando, entre otras temáticas, la importancia de la emocionalidad del ciudadano y su impacto en la política democrática, el diseño constitucional y las expectativas colectivas, la incidencia de los sentimientos políticos en los proyectos constitucionales, el desenvolvimiento histórico de esta última en la política de América Latina, entre otras.
Nos ha enviado también cordiales saludos la señora decana de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Católica de Córdoba, doctora Julieta Galino. Hacemos presente que este evento ha sido declarado de interés legislativo por la legislatura de la provincia de Córdoba y de interés general por resolución del Honorable Consejo Directivo de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Agradecemos también la presencia del señor Ministro de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación, doctor Horacio Rosati. Participan de esta sesión inaugural la profesora Mónica Cingolani, decana de la Facultad de Ciencia Política de esta Casa de Estudios, el profesor Guillermo Barrera Buteler, decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, la profesora Marta Altave, presidenta de la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional. Nos acompaña también en forma remota desde la Universidad de Melbourne, Australia, la profesora Adrienne Stone, presidente de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional, y por supuesto el profesor doctor Paolo Riveri, profesor de las Universidades Nacional y Católica de Córdoba y miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional.
Hola, ¿me escuchan? Estimadas autoridades de poderes del Estado, autoridades universitarias, colegas docentes, investigadores, investigadoras, queridos y queridas estudiantes. Buen día a todos y a todas. Tengo la enorme alegría de darles la bienvenida a estas jornadas de la Mesa Redonda de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional, que se desarrollarán hoy martes en nuestra casa, en la Universidad Católica de Córdoba, y mañana miércoles en la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Ambas universidades tenemos mucho en común, como una parte de nuestra historia, y también un docente, el doctor Paolo Riveri, quien felizmente propició esta enorme iniciativa. Me honra darles la bienvenida hoy en nombre de nuestra universidad, fundada en 1956. Fue la primera universidad privada del país y es la única en Argentina confiada a la Compañía de Jesús, continuando una tradición histórica de compromiso con la educación, iniciada por la Compañía de Jesús en el siglo XVI en toda Latinoamérica. Es necesario y oportuno reflexionar sobre emociones constitucionales. Necesario, porque la verdadera dimensión de la vida constitucional de una jurisdicción se comprende reconociendo su contribución a la integración de los ciudadanos y las ciudadanas en una unidad colectiva con fines y bienes comunes. Hay tensiones y hay integración, y la Constitución es, ante todo, integración. Los sentimientos constitucionales son manifestación cultural, y las constituciones no pueden entenderse al margen de la cultura. Y es oportuno, por la creciente fragmentación y polarización social y política que interpelan la capacidad de las democracias constitucionales para integrar las diferencias. En América Latina, además, altos niveles de corrupción, autoritarismo, desconfianza, vuelven pertinente trabajar para legitimar el poder, conectarlo con la realidad y propiciar motivos para una adhesión afectiva al ordenamiento que organiza la convivencia. Finalmente, es responsabilidad de las universidades el trabajo permanente de actualización y profundización del conocimiento y el aliento al pensamiento crítico. La universidad es el lugar de serena y abierta investigación y discusión sobre la verdad. Estamos entonces en el lugar adecuado, con las personas pertinentes, para tener una reflexión necesaria y oportuna. Nuestro padre rector, el doctor Alfonso Gómez, encomienda los frutos de este encuentro. Buena jornada para todos y todas.
Bueno, muy buenos días, autoridades presentes. Omito por razones de tiempo la enumeración de las personalidades tan importantes que nos acompañan. Quiero sumarme a la bienvenida que acaba de dar la decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad Católica como decano de la Universidad, de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Para mí, como para ella, es un altísimo honor darles la bienvenida a nuestra Córdoba, esta ciudad que con sus 4 siglos de vida universitaria es el centro de estudios superiores más antiguo de América y segundo de América del Sur. Como decano siento un alto honor de darles, junto con la decana de Ciencias Políticas de la Católica, a ustedes, brillantes estudiosos del fenómeno jurídico-político que es objeto de este congreso, provenientes de diversas partes del mundo y de nuestro país. Con este acto inaugural dejamos abierta esta mesa redonda de la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional, para la que han aunado esfuerzos las Universidades Nacional de Córdoba, Católica de Córdoba, la Universidad de San Andrés, la Universidad Austral, junto a las asociaciones Argentina e Internacional de Derecho Constitucional. El tema sobre el que va a versar este encuentro científico, académico, me parece de altísimo interés y un acierto, porque creo que es un tema no suficientemente explorado no suficiente, no digo no explorado, pero no suficientemente explorado. Las emociones políticas y sentimientos constitucionales. Es que pareciera prevalecer cierta tendencia a reducir la Constitución a una dimensión puramente racional normativa, perdiendo de vista que la Constitución es un fenómeno de múltiples dimensiones, en donde la humanidad, la sociabilidad, la cultura y el derecho se aunan. La Constitución es ese punto de confluencia entre lo político y lo jurídico, es ese punto donde lo político pareciera cristalizarse en instituciones jurídicas. Y por lo tanto, si hay un componente político y un componente cultural, los sentimientos y emociones tienen una fuerza movilizadora muy grande, no solo en la génesis de los textos constitucionales, sino sobre todo en esa interpretación y reinterpretación que a lo largo de su vida y desarrollo la van tornando una realidad viviente. No puedo dejar de evocar, para cerrar esta breve introducción, no puedo dejar de evocar a un viejo profesor de nuestra casa de estudio, que hace más de, César Enrique Romero, que hace más de medio siglo nos hablaba ya de la importancia de la ideología constitucional y de las creencias constitucionales como fundamento del orden constitucional. No dudo entonces del éxito de estas deliberaciones que se inician en este acto, no dudo que las conclusiones y reflexiones serán sumamente enriquecedoras, de manera que descuento el éxito de esta jornada. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, buenos días a las personas presentes en este hermosísimo y bello auditorio y también a quienes vía remota nos están siguiendo. Yo creo que el estar acá en la DOCTA, que es la cuna de las universidades, el inicio de los estudios universitarios en nuestro país, es muy significativo de del título de estas jornadas. El título de estas jornadas, Sentimientos políticos y emociones morales en el derecho constitucional, es muy significativo para nuestro país, para el derecho constitucional fundamentalmente y para la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional. En nombre de la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional, quiero augurar el éxito absoluto de estas jornadas organizadas por la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional. Y decirles que digo que es significativo que hayan elegido esta temática porque tiene que ver directamente con la génesis de nuestro derecho constitucional. Es decir, las emociones, las emociones morales y los sentimientos políticos son los que impulsaron a los convencionales constituyentes del 53 a generar estas ideas plasmadas en el preámbulo y en el texto de nuestra Constitución Nacional, que tiene que ver con todo lo proactivo hacia la consolidación de los sistemas democráticos. Y nosotros, como miembros de la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional, tenemos como objetivo en nuestro estatuto el promocionar el estudio de las ciencias políticas y del derecho constitucional. Y para ello tenemos que trabajar permanentemente con sentimientos políticos y emociones morales positivas, proactivas, en coadyuvar la consolidación de los regímenes democráticos en nuestro continente y en todo el mundo. Así que para la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional, a quien represento, Es un momento gratísimo y sumamente importante el poder disfrutar de estas 2 jornadas que deseo para los presentes y para quienes nos están siguiendo por vía remota, que sea del gusto que nosotros esperamos. Gracias.
I'm the president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, and it's my pleasure to say a few remarks on behalf of the IACL at the opening of this roundtable on the theme political sentiments and moral emotions in constitutional law. The roundtable is hosted by our dear colleague, Professor Paolo Riveri, and I acknowledge as well the support for the roundtable from the National University of Cordoba, from Austro University, the University of San Andres, the Catholic University of Cordoba, and the Argentine Association of Constitutional Law. I would also like to acknowledge the presence here of many distinguished guests, including His Honour Chief Justice Horacio Rosati of the Argentine Supreme Court, other distinguished members of the judiciary, Dean Singolani and Borrero Butela, and President Altabe of the Argentine Association of Constitutional Law, and the Rector of the National University of Cordoba, as well as members of the National Academy of Law. As this distinguished guest list shows, our colleague, Professor Riveri, has pulled off something rather impressive here today. The lingering effects of the terrible global pandemic have continued to make travel difficult and to disrupt academic endeavours of all kinds. But Professor Riveri has been undeterred. In addition to fortitude and skill, he has shown rare intellectual vision and imagination. This program focuses on aspects of our humanity, our emotions and our morality that are often overlooked in the study of constitutionalism, and yet which seem to be critical determinants of constitutional success. These are questions of enduring significance, but they take on particular importance in the context of crisis and democratic decay, which are sadly so much a feature of our times. This theme is also highly appropriate for an international gathering such as this. The comparative examination of the strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures of multiple diverse constitutional systems is a very promising way to address these difficult questions. The overriding objective of the International Association of Constitutional Law is to provide a forum in which constitutionalists from all parts of the world can reflect on constitutional problems with insights drawn from constitutions and constitutional systems globally. This gathering on this important topic is in its best tradition. I am deeply grateful to Professor Riveri for his leadership, to our Argentinian colleagues for their support, and to the very extraordinary group of scholars who have gathered here today. I am so sorry that I am not with you in person, but I will be following attentively, and I'm greatly looking forward to the fascinating discussions that I know that will follow. Thank you very much.
I will start in Spanish and then I will turn into English because I'm going to say some words welcoming all of you. We are very pleased, very glad, we are delighted, enjoying this opportunity and harnessing your wise and savvy scholar lectures would be actually very important for all of us. So with all due respect, I would like to speak very shortly, because of course we have an agenda which is coming, and we have the music that will be here in a few minutes. But let me tell you once again, from the bottom of my heart, that we feel delighted. We're very grateful. We know that you have a long journey to come over to Argentina, and this is an opportunity because we are in a peripheral country. We are in the deep global south, and it's very meaningful for us to bring you here, and hopefully we can exchange, we can learn from you. This is very important, and now I would like to turn into Spanish. Le estaba diciendo lo agradecidos que estamos. Mis palabras están dirigidas fundamentalmente hacia los visitantes extranjeros. Acá estamos perdidos en la lost in non-translation. Lamentablemente no tenemos traducción simultánea y es posible que alguna de estas ideas puedan perderse. Entonces quería rápidamente, ante el mensaje de la presidenta Stone, manifestarles a nuestros visitantes lo agradecidos que estamos. Yo quiero remarcar mi profundo agradecimiento a quienes han hecho posible esto. Yo simplemente traté de amalgamar esfuerzos generosos y solidarios, y quiero destacar, por supuesto, las casas de altos estudios donde tengo la fortuna de dar clases, la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba y la Universidad Católica de Córdoba, la figura de su decano y la decana, que generosamente fueron un apoyo fundamental, invaluable. Pero también a otras universidades del país, fundamentalmente de Buenos Aires, que generosamente admitieron que este evento tuviera lugar en la periferia de la periferia, que sea aquí en Córdoba, ¿no? Entonces a la Universidad Austral, en la figura de su decano, Manuel García Mancilla, la Universidad de San Andrés, en la figura también de su rector, que hoy no está presente, Lucas Grossman. Y quiero manifestarle también el agradecimiento a la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional. Hay avatares políticos, pero muchos de los asociados, muchos de los académicos han sabido mirar por encima de las cuestiones circunstanciales y con compromiso académico nos han brindado su apoyo. Agradezco también a las personalidades públicas que están aquí presentes, a los miembros del Poder Judicial, fundamentalmente al querido profesor Rosati, que también es actualmente presidente, Chief Justice of our National Supreme Court, al expresidente Sapsay. Acá tenemos dos expresidentes muy importantes en nuestra asociación, el profesor Antonio María Hernández y el profesor Sagüez, queridos profesores de nuestra academia. Muy agradecidos con los señores legisladores, con la diputada Brenda Austin, también ha sido invalorable su apoyo. Y un saludo especial, very important and very special gratitude is aiming the current Vice President, first of the National Association of Constitutional Law, Helen Krunke, and Marcelo Figueredo, another member of the Executive Committee that came over in very difficult times, dire situations with pandemic and war in Europe. Another word, I'm switching to English again, to let him know that we are very grateful, know how important he is aims to Professor András Chayo, who is actually former member of the European Court of Human Rights, al profesor Chayo, que es miembro del Tribunal Europeo de Derechos Humanos. Y no quiero dejar mencionar a otro querido amigo que siempre está al pie del cañón, que es el Ricardo Ramírez Calvo, ¿no? A quienes enviaron también sus papers, el Call for Papers, colegas nacionales, algunos ya académicos formados. Acá lo veo a Pedro Caminos, a Lorena González Toqui, Sofía Sagüez, Elfman, que está pasando alguno, Victorino Solá, bueno, muy agradecidos con ellos. Y espero que esto sea auspicioso, que sea inspirador y que sea sobre todo una oportunidad para estrechar vínculos. In short, to wrap it all, the most important goal of this meeting is trying to stretch bonds, to be closer, friendship, and to get something in our back. So all my best wishes, very grateful, very happy. Let's start this conference, this round table. But first we have 1 minute of music to relax. So now I invite the musicians to come over.
A continuación, la agrupación Flor Sur interpretará para nosotros, en primer lugar, Marrón y Azul de Astor Piazzolla. Junto a Daniela Dalmazo interpretarán Both Sides Now de Johnny Mitchell y por último, Negracha de Osvaldo Pugliese.
and circus crowds. I've looked at life that way. But now old friends, they're acting strange. They shake their heads, they say I've changed. Well, something's lost and something's gained in living
agradecemos a la agrupación por las interpretaciones y para continuar con la actividad de esta mesa redonda, invitamos al señor presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación, al doctor Horacio Rosati, para participar del panel como expositor. Y agradecemos la participación del doctor Guillermo Barrera Buteler como moderador.
Bueno, continuando con esta mesa redonda, y la verdad que debo decir que me toca un privilegio muy especial, porque no todos los días le toca a uno presentar nada más y nada menos que al presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación. Pero la verdad es que creo que más importante que presentar al presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación es presentar a este gran humanista y eximio jurista que es Horacio Rosati. Algo más que presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia de la Nación. Digo gran humanista y eximio jurista porque Horacio es una persona que tiene un acabado y sentido e integral conocimiento de la Constitución y del orden constitucional argentino. Profundo conocimiento que le viene no solo de conocerla como texto, sino de conocerla como fenómeno de múltiples dimensiones. Y no voy a perder el tiempo presentando a quien todos conocen y su currículum lo conocen sobremanera, pero solo quiero destacar con algunas pinceladas el nivel y la jerarquía del expositor que va a abrir esta jornada, esta mesa redonda. Horacio, decimos que tiene un conocimiento profundo del orden constitucional argentino porque lo conoce desde diversas perspectivas. Desde la perspectiva académica, sin lugar a dudas. Desde la perspectiva académica porque su labor como profesor de Derecho Constitucional, pero no solo de Derecho Constitucional, de Derecho Público Provincial y Municipal. Y además, como profesor de Teoría del Estado, le dan una base sólida para un conocimiento desde los fundamentos y hasta la organización integral del orden jurídico argentino, sistema complejo, como todos saben, porque integra diversos niveles estatales, desde el orden federal, el provincial, el municipal y el de la ciudad autónoma de Buenos Aires. A lo cual Horacio suma sus conocimientos como, bueno, obviamente su doctorado y postdoctorado en Derecho, el doctorado en Historia, que contribuye a afianzar todavía más los fundamentos del conocimiento de nuestra Constitución. Los 30 libros, más de 30 libros que Horacio tiene publicados de su autoría, son prueba acabada de esto. Su membresía en varias numerosas academias, entre ellas la Academia de Derecho de Córdoba. Su ex condición de presidente de la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional, los premios de que ha sido merecedor, entre los que solo menciono el premio Conex de Platino. Bueno, son una prueba acabada de su conocimiento desde la faz académica. Pero Horacio es un conocedor de la Constitución no solo desde la faz académica, sino desde la faz práctica. desde la faz práctica y, por un lado, desde la práctica política, porque ha sido intendente de la ciudad de Santa Fe, como todos sabemos, ha sido ministro de Justicia y Derechos Humanos, y además, desde ya, desde la práctica profesional, tanto en el ejercicio libre de la profesión, cuanto desde el ejercicio de la magistratura. Bueno, creo que no hace falta que siga abundando, para poner de manifiesto que estamos ante reitero, un gran y profundo humanista, jurista y profundo conocedor del orden constitucional argentino. Con ustedes, entonces, el primer expositor en esta mesa redonda, el doctor Horacio Rosati.
Bueno, mi profundo agradecimiento a los organizadores por esta invitación que realmente me honra, a la Asociación Internacional de Derecho Constitucional, a la Asociación Argentina de Derecho Constitucional, a la Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, a la Universidad Católica de Córdoba, a la Universidad Austral, a la Universidad San Andrés. Agradezco profundamente la presencia de todos ustedes, de tan distinguidos profesores y profesoras que nos visitan desde el exterior o que siguen este evento por un medio virtual. Y la verdad que tengo que decir inicialmente, queridos y queridas amigas constitucionalistas, que siempre para mí es un enorme placer interrumpir las actividades que puedo tener para estar con ustedes. Realmente para mí es un placer y es un honor compartir estos momentos y tratar de estar a la altura de las circunstancias y de ponerme al día en el tema constitucional. Yendo a nuestro tema, quisiera titular esta conferencia con una interrogación, con un signo de pregunta. ¿Sentimientos constitucionales? Y veremos si puedo intentar esbozar una respuesta al final de esta intervención. Creo que tenemos que tomar como punto de partida conceptual, pero más como punto de partida histórico y geográfico, al origen del constitucionalismo contemporáneo. Porque el constitucionalismo, tal como lo conocemos, en tanto fenómeno que permite organizar la sociedad política a través de un documento escrito llamado Constitución, que reconoce derechos y establece un diseño de las instituciones, visto desde esta perspectiva, desde la perspectiva del tema que nos ocupa hoy, es también, o podemos verlo también, como un intento de racionalizar las pasiones. Porque el constitucionalismo contemporáneo, más allá de sus valiosos orígenes y antecedentes, lo que hace es cristalizar procesos revolucionarios. Procesos revolucionarios que son todo pasión, sobre todo la Revolución Francesa, también la revolución de la independencia de las colonias inglesas en América del Norte. Y esa pasión y esa emoción es luego procesada, manufacturada. Esa materia prima que es la pasión y el sentimiento es manufacturado por la razón, concretado en una constitución. Y lo que queda es lo que sabemos, el texto escrito. Pero todo el intangible que es la emoción, el contenido afectivo, en gran medida se evapora. Y después lo que nos queda es el texto, e interpretamos el texto y nos alejamos cada vez más de ese momento augural que era ese momento emotivo, pasional, cargado de sentimientos. El constitucionalismo contemporáneo se basó en un paradigma. Ese paradigma era el del antropocentrismo racional. el hombre racional, el hombre como medida de todas las cosas. Sabemos que hay valiosos antecedentes desde el Renacimiento, pero la filosofía de Descartes, el protestantismo religioso, la posibilidad de interpretar libremente y racionalmente las Sagradas Escrituras, son todos en la astronomía el nuevo paradigma de que la Tierra no es el centro del universo, sino un pequeño planeta que orbita en torno a una de las millones de estrellas que hay en el universo. Pero, dirá Pascal, contemporáneo de Descartes, el hombre es un junco, es una caña, es algo muy débil, una gota de vapor puede terminar con él, pero mientras el hombre sabe de su inferioridad con relación al universo, el universo nada sabe de él. Es decir, el factor racional y el antropocentrismo, el hombre y ya no Dios como centro de imputación, como fuente de poder y como factor de entendimiento de la realidad. Este es el punto en el que tenemos que ubicar, me parece, para entender el por qué hoy hablamos de sentimientos constitucionales. Porque este experimento exitoso, que terminó siendo exitoso del constitucionalismo contemporáneo, de racionalizar las pasiones, fue un experimento exitoso, pero también muy riesgoso. Recordemos lo que ocurrió 15 años después de eclosionada la Revolución Francesa. Un militar revolucionario se convirtió en un emperador, todo lo contrario de lo que planteaba la revolución. Y creo que quien analiza y quien estudia la vida de tal vez, el principal protagonista de la Revolución Francesa, Maximilien Robespierre, verá lo conflictivo que es pasar de la pasión a la razón. Robespierre, que en el proceso prerrevolucionario era un abolicionista de la pena de muerte, la aplicó sin dudarlo en el proceso revolucionario a sus adversarios y le fue aplicada a él. Y antes de serla aplicada terminó en la locura. Creo que tenemos que reparar desde ciencias auxiliares al derecho constitucional, que es muy complejo esto de procesar emociones y llevarlas luego a un texto. Robespierre, que muere ejecutado, no ya de la forma tradicional, fusilado, agujereado su corazón, receptáculo de la pasión, sino con su cabeza seccionada, cabeza separada del cuerpo, como pensaba Descartes, el ser extenso y el ser pensante, que dejaba inerte a la cabeza receptáculo del cerebro y de la razón. Pero este experimento del constitucionalismo fue un experimento exitoso, decíamos. Se expandió luego de eclosionar en el último tercio del siglo XVIII, en Francia, en América del Norte, en el siglo XIX por toda América, siglo XX también en África y en otros países del mundo. Pero entonces, si decimos que fue un experimento exitoso, aquel que en gran medida racionalizó las pasiones para llevarla a declaraciones de derechos, a un diseño institucional del poder que plantea el recelo como forma de equilibrio, la desconfianza como forma de equilibrio, no el cambio de adentro hacia afuera, sino en gran medida, como pensaba Montesquieu, de afuera hacia adentro, la rivalidad entre los detentadores del poder, como lo dice Madison en el Federalista, como estrategia. ¿Por qué estamos hablando de sentimientos? Porque gran parte de este presupuesto que era el antropocentrismo racionalista, el hombre racional, ha tenido y tiene hoy puntos de fisura, de contestación. Nos resulta en alguna medida insuficiente. la psicología social, la inteligencia emocional, la neurociencia han venido a poner en cuestionamiento esto de que la racionalidad es solamente del ser humano, primero, y segundo, que la racionalidad es lo único que distingue al ser humano. Leía hace menos de una semana que, y lo voy a hacer textual, el director del Consejo Científico del Ministerio de Educación de Francia sostenía que en la ciencia cognitiva en estos días, un neurocientífico, ¿verdad?, ya no hacemos una distinción entre cognición y emoción. Las emociones son cálculos bastante específicos en circuitos particulares, a menudo circuitos antiguos que heredamos de millones de años de evolución. No hay nada diferente entre los sistemas emocionales y los sistemas cognitivos. Todos se realizan decodificando tipos computacionales y las emociones realmente ayudan en la mayoría de los casos. Más allá de que se compartan o no este tipo de reflexiones, lo cierto es que la dimensión emotiva ha cobrado en los últimos años un valor como mínimo complementario al de la razón en el ser humano. Pero también otros presupuestos del constitucionalismo clásico han entrado en crisis. Hoy sabemos que el ser humano no es un ser vacío, neutro, que puede ser llenado con cualquier contenido. Sabemos que hay contenidos biológicos, hereditarios, que están latentes y que nos acompañan hasta el último de nuestros días. Sabemos que el paradigma con el que estudiamos las ciencias sociales no es el mismo que la Revolución Francesa, porque en la Ilustración el ejemplo, el paradigma justamente de la ciencia era la ciencia natural y el método era el método de la ciencia natural. Recordemos esto de unificar a la sociedad con la naturaleza y dentro de las ciencias naturales la física, lograr ese nivel de exactitud. Tal vez el ejemplo más insólito, más excelso y tal vez más literario y más romántico sea el calendario revolucionario francés, una extraña mixtura entre física, astronomía, matemática, clima, flora y fauna. Pues hoy las ciencias sociales se estudian de otra manera. Si en las ciencias naturales el paradigma es uno, mientras rige, o el calor dilata los metales o no dilata los metales, en las ciencias sociales justamente el paradigma es la ausencia de certezas y el constante volver sobre los viejos temas, modificando las soluciones y los criterios. Pero además, a diferencia del constitucionalismo clásico, ya no pensamos como pensaba Rousseau, que hay una voluntad general única que todos interpretamos de la misma manera, sino que de alguna forma esa voluntad general la construimos a partir de nuestros distintos intereses, motivaciones, creencias e ideologías. De modo que estamos frente a una situación muy distinta a la de la Revolución Francesa, que fue una revolución ampliamente inclusiva, teniendo en cuenta el modelo, el antiguo régimen que se dejaba, pero que estaba pensada para el hombre racional, el hombre, no la mujer, el hombre racional. El atributo de la mujer en esa época se pensaba que era otro, no la racionalidad, sino justamente la emotividad. Y además era un modelo pensado para los que tenían racionalidad, no para los que todavía no la tenían como los niños, no era un modelo inclusivo para los que habían dejado de tenerla como los valetudinarios y tampoco para los que la tenían de un modo diferente, los discapacitados mentales. Hoy, todos estos sectores, por supuesto, reclaman legítimamente la inclusión, de modo que a la racionalidad, evidentemente, en nuestras sociedades hay que agregarle algo más. Por eso, distintos autores, John Elster, Martha Nussbaum, James Mansbridge, Thomas Nagel, están desde distintas perspectivas. András, no sé bien cómo se pronuncia, Sayó, voy a decir yo, lo voy a pronunciar mal seguramente. Están incorporando sentimientos como la vergüenza, el resentimiento, el odio, los celos, la envidia, para interpretar, comprender la realidad desde una perspectiva no solamente racional. Y lo están haciendo a partir de distintas investigaciones que tienen distintos nortes: el feminismo, el populismo, los mecanismos participativos de la democracia, etc. Son búsquedas distintas. La graduación de la sanción en materia penal son investigaciones diferentes, pero que todas recaen en la necesidad de profundizar en el costado emotivo, en la dimensión emotiva, sentimental y afectiva, que al menos complemente la dimensión racional en el análisis jurídico y de las ciencias sociales. Desde nuestra perspectiva, reivindicamos el sentimiento constitucional. ¿Qué queremos decir con sentimiento? Cuando uno lee lo que ha leído, ve que a veces las expresiones emoción, sentimiento se utilizan de modo análogo. Yo prefiero pensar que el sentimiento es una predisposición afectiva que, basada en una creencia, se expresa como reacción a un estímulo. Y para desarrollar esta caracterización es importante establecer qué no es el sentimiento. El sentimiento no debe confundirse con el estímulo que lo provoca, que puede ser, estímulos distintos pueden generar la reacción del sentimiento. Un insulto o una reverencia puede motivar al mismo sentimiento. Quiere decir que no hay que confundirlo con aquello que lo genera, ni tampoco con la reacción que genera. Tampoco tenemos que confundir la violencia o la reverencia con el sentimiento. Porque el sentimiento, como dice Martha Nussbaum, para desligarlo de ciertas reacciones que son vitales, pero que no descansan en una creencia como el hambre y la sed, hay detrás del sentimiento una creencia. Ya esto lo sostenía Aristóteles. Y esa creencia es lo que genera luego la reacción. No hay que confundir el sentimiento con la creencia. La creencia es, de alguna forma, pasiva. El sentimiento se expone, se basa en una creencia. O sea, el sentimiento no es ni un arquero, ni el arco, la ballesta, ni la flecha, ni el blanco. Es la predisposición para, con la flecha tensada y la ballesta preparada, que el arquero dispare esa flecha cuando recibe el estímulo. Por eso no debemos confundirlos con algunas actitudes que tienen que ver con necesidades vitales, insisto, como en algunas ocasiones ocurre. Cuando decimos que el sentimiento es una predisposición afectiva o emotiva, entendemos la emotividad, la afectividad como algo distinto de la racionalidad, pero no como algo opuesto, no como lo irracional, sino como algo distinto, que puede ser claramente complementario. Desde nuestra perspectiva, hay tres sentimientos que pueden, hay muchos más, pero digamos, desde mi perspectiva, hay tres sentimientos que pueden articularse con la racionalidad constitucional para mejorar la calidad de las decisiones constitucionales. Estos tres sentimientos son el egoísmo, el altruismo y la envidia. El egoísmo es, como sabemos, un apego desproporcionado hacia el propio interés, que se desinteresa del prójimo. El altruismo es justamente lo contrario, la predisposición hacia el prójimo, incluso en contra del propio beneficio o el propio interés. Y la envidia es un recelo malsano, típico del comparatista, que o quiere algo que un tercero tiene, pero fundamentalmente lo que lo distingue es que está dispuesto a no progresar o a progresar él con tal de que el resto progrese menos. A no lograr lo que él quiere lograr en tanto el resto no lo logre. Pongamos la figura clásica de tres nadadores, un egoísta, un envidioso y un altruista. Los tres quieren ganar la carrera. Los tres comienzan nadando por sus andariveles. ¿Qué ocurre si uno de los tres tiene un percance y pide auxilio? El egoísta seguirá nadando hasta llegar al final. Se desinteresará del prójimo y dirá, seguramente para autojustificarse, que él no es el causante del mal ajeno. ¿Qué hará el altruista si escucha pedir auxilio al otro nadador? Dejará de lado su propio interés de llegar rápidamente a la otra orilla y le prestará auxilio aún a costa de perder la carrera. Y el envidioso no solamente no prestará auxilio al que lo pide, sino que si ve que algún nadador va delante de él, lo tomará del tobillo y lo tirará para atrás, porque él no quiere que otro tenga lo que él quiere. Si nosotros lo proyectamos a esto, a la sociedad, está claro que, y digamos, tanto en términos personales como en términos sociales, hay egoísmo, altruismo y envidia. Si esto nos llevamos a un término del funcionamiento de la sociedad, uno diría, bueno, como James Madison, si los hombres fueran ángeles, no se necesitarían las constituciones, ni la división de poderes y todo lo demás, y la declaración de los derechos, pues sería obvia, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, si fuésemos todos altruistas, a lo mejor no estaríamos hablando aquí de estos temas. Si lo que predomina es el egoísmo, bueno, será una cuestión de cómo se controla, cómo se compensa, cómo se asiste al que pide auxilio. Pero si lo que predomina es la envidia, no se puede construir una sociedad. Nosotros. Es prácticamente imposible, es prácticamente insostenible. Entonces creo que sobre la base de estos tres sentimientos se podría proyectar. El tema es cómo lo proyectamos al análisis constitucional. Bueno, yo veo inicialmente tres vías, tres posibilidades. Una es una construcción intelectual que prevea el diseño de las instituciones teniendo en cuenta estos tres sentimientos. Una especie de construcción a los John Rawls y su teoría de la justicia, ¿no es cierto? Nos manejaríamos en un nivel de abstracción que supera el propio del texto constitucional y de su interpretación. Otra vía sería la vía constituyente, es decir, incorporar a estos sentimientos como principios, como el principio de juridicidad o como el principio de igualdad o como criterios interpretativos como sería la razonabilidad en la aplicación, ¿verdad? Tendríamos inconvenientes en las dos vías estas, ya vamos a decir cuáles muy rápidamente. Y la tercera vía sería la vía de los poderes constituidos. El legislador y el reglamentador tendrían problemas similares al del constituyente, porque, digamos, se está manejando en un contexto normativo. Y después quedaría el juez. Le vamos a dar al juez el poder de interpretar sentimental, afectivamente, modificando el texto de la Constitución conforme a un caso que deba resolver. Es complicado, ¿no es cierto? Muy complicado. El problema de una construcción intelectual al estilo de la teoría de la justicia es su confrontación con la realidad. Los problemas lógicos que tuvo Rawls para explicar y para justificar y para validar su velo de la ignorancia en la posición original, por ejemplo, ¿no es cierto? Los problemas que tendría la vía constitucional de incorporar sentimientos. Entre paréntesis, volví a leer por enésima vez la Constitución argentina para ver si había palabras que me remitían al afecto y prácticamente no las encontré, ni aún en la reforma del 94. Quiere decir que esta idea de racionalizar la pasión funciona y funciona mucho para nosotros los juristas. Bueno, la segunda vía, decía, tendría también algunas complicaciones, ¿no es cierto?, de cómo articular y además no caer en la tentación de volver a racionalizar, volver a sacarle el espíritu a estos sentimientos, porque pues esto hay que decirlo de alguna manera. Y la tercera vía, la vía de los poderes constituidos, también tendría dificultades, ¿no es cierto? El legislador, ¿cómo incorpora los sentimientos? ¿Cómo incorpora la dimensión afectiva? Si lo que tiene que hacer es volcarlo en palabras. Esta traducción a palabras es una traducción hasta ahora casi inexorablemente racional, porque después interpretamos la palabra. En el sistema anglosajón interpretamos el precedente, pero siempre podemos manipular un poquito la palabra, manipular un poquito el precedente, pero siempre con un criterio racional. Y la vía de los poderes constituidos, como decíamos entonces, tiene también complicaciones, pero creo que es un intento fundamental. Yo creo, y con esto concluyo, volviendo al principio de la pregunta, ¿sentimientos constitucionales? Sí, sería la respuesta. Sí, por supuesto que sí. Sí. Para renegar de la racionalidad constitucional, del proceso del constitucionalismo contemporáneo, de ninguna manera. Para vivificarlo, para complementarlo, para tratar de que esta dimensión humana, revalorada en los últimos años, que es la dimensión afectiva, que se expresa en distintos aspectos, en el bienestar, en el buen vivir, en cierto desapego, en el cambio de las costumbres de nuestra alimentación, en el desapego cada vez más creciente de determinados sectores de la comunidad, a la noción de éxito como conquista de bienes materiales, etcétera, etcétera. Creo que es muy importante poner la dimensión del sentimiento en el ámbito constitucional, para que del paradigma del hombre racional pasemos al paradigma de la persona íntegra, integral, con todas sus dimensiones. ¿Podremos hacerlo nosotros que tenemos una matriz tan formalista, tan racionalista, tan de silogismos, tan de teorías puras del derecho? Yo creo que sí, que podemos hacerlo, que es muy importante, y por eso celebro ampliamente esta convocatoria y agradezco profundamente esta posibilidad de dirigirme a ustedes con estas pocas ideas. Muchas gracias.
A continuación vamos a hacer un coffee break.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of this roundtable organized by the International Association of Constitutional Law, in which we are going to hear, I'm sure, very interesting thoughts and remarks in connection with the importance of constitutional emotions for a democratic polity. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and after they finish their presentation, we are going to have, hopefully, a 20 to 30 minutes Q&A section. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Hele Krunke. Professor Krunke is head of the Center for European and Comparative Legal Studies of the Faculty of Law of the University of Copenhagen, and also she's the Vice President of the International Association of Constitutional Law. Professor Krunke, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for this very nice introduction, and I would also like to thank especially, of course, Professor Riveri for organizing this very interesting roundtable. Professor Riveri told me about his vision about this roundtable actually 4 years ago at a roundtable in India held by the International Association of Constitutional Law. And I'm so very, very pleased to be here today to share this important academic event with Professor Riveri and everyone here in the room. I also would like to thank, of course, obviously, all the universities here in Cordoba which have been involved in organizing this very, very interesting roundtable. Okay, so what I've been asked today to present a paper, and I've chosen to present a paper on the emotional context of the term Nordic Exceptionalism regarding constitutional review of legislation, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by these terms in a second. Go. So this is the title of the presentation. So let me start by saying a few words about what I mean by the Nordic countries, because now we are what I think it was called the deep global south, I believe you said, Professor Riveri. It's very far away. I come from the, I'm not sure, deep, far up north part of the globe. So I have brought a map today to just show you where we find the Nordic countries in the world. I'm sure maybe you know, but the Nordic countries refer to the Nordic countries, which is Denmark, and the Danish realm actually consists of, besides Denmark, which is very, very small. I'm not even sure I'll try this if I could point it out here. No, here you go. Here. So this is actually my country. It's very small, as you can tell, here up at far north. And but part of the Danish realm, we're very lucky. We also share with Greenland and the Faroe Islands, which is this part. And other Nordic countries are, of course, Sweden, which we have here, Norway, and then Finland. So those are the Nordic countries, and this is where we are today, at least in my presentation. Some of you might actually know best the Nordic countries, I think, from the Vikings. I think at this moment it seems that all the broadcast companies are making movies and series about the Vikings. I'm not sure how true they are to the history, but at least I thought that might help you a little getting in the mood for my presentation. So let's return to the topic. So what do I mean by Nordic exceptionalism? What is that? So this is actually not a term invented by Nordic scholars. It's actually a term invented by Professor Rand Herschel, whom you might know, a very famous comparative constitutional scholar. And he invented this term in an article in the International Journal of Constitutional Law in 2011. And here Herschel reflects on the traditional Nordic reluctance vis-à-vis judicial review. And by this I mean that the Nordic courts, compared to courts almost in all other places of the world, show reluctance as regards judicial review. And as you can tell, I've put quite a lot of text on my slides, and I've done that on purpose, just so it's easier to follow what I'm saying. Now, while we have this, these sort of reluctant courts in the Nordic countries, we at the same time are lucky that we score exceptionally high in international indexes on democracy and good governance. So we have this cocktail, maybe it's a paradox, we'll discuss that, of reluctant courts on the one hand, and then on the other hand, countries that score very high as regards democracy and good governance. And I've brought a quote from Rand Herschel's article where he says it makes the Nordic countries an ideal setting for assessing some of the core insights of canonical constitutional theory. Most notably, the traditional Nordic resistance to judicial hyperactivism alongside the region's exceptional record on both the democracy and human development fronts provide ample material to assess the perception of judicial review as a necessary supplement to democracy and its supposed contribution to human development and good governance. So, it is simply actually normally assumed that a precondition for a sound democracy and for good governance is strong courts which perform active judicial review. So how can judicial restraint be combined with a high level of democracy and good governance in the Nordic context? Like I said, this could be seen as a paradox, but let's discuss that a little closer. I believe that the answer is actually to be found in the emotional context of the Nordic constitutional systems, which is why I've chosen to speak about this today, because I think that it might actually, hopefully, fit well into to the topic of today. But I don't expect that you know a lot about the legal systems in the far up north of Europe. So let's first have a look at the characteristics of the Nordic legal systems. So the Nordic legal systems are normally viewed as actually as a separate legal family. And if we look at this traditional common law versus civil law distinction, the Nordic legal systems are closest to, but definitely not identical with, the civil law tradition. Some of the characteristics of the Nordic legal systems are that it's the importance attached to preparatory legislative material when we interpret legislation. That's a special Nordic thing. And it's also that all-embracing legal principles play a more limited role in Nordic law than we see, for instance, in French or German law. We have no civil codes in the far north, and absence of an actual reception of Roman law, and a specific legal method which is less theoretical and conceptualized approach to legal problems. Then we have something called Scandinavian Realism. You might have heard about the US American Realism, and we have it's a little like the American one and also a little different. We have something called Scandinavian Realism. And then also the limited importance of legal formalities is also a special feature of the Nordic legal systems. Now, at the macro level, the Nordic constitutional systems share many similarities, and I think that's normally what the outside viewer will notice. So people coming from outside of the Nordic region, they always get the impression that the Nordic legal systems are very much alike. And of course, they are very much alike, but if you are an insider at the micro level, we could also call it, you see the differences appear between the different Nordic countries in the legal systems. I think you could say that at a deeper level of values, the Nordic countries have many similarities. However, there are also sort of smaller differences in the constitutional systems. So, if we then turn to constitutional review of legislation, which is what I would like to talk about today, and have a further look at this Nordic reluctance. So, it is a main common feature of all the Nordic constitutional systems that we have this reluctance towards constitutional review. The Nordic countries are countries with no constitutional courts, but the Supreme Courts, they perform the constitutional review. And the courts are, of course, independent of the political institutions. Then we have this East versus, let me see if I can find this. Oh, sorry. Then we have this there we go, East tradition versus the West tradition. And what do I mean by that? So the Nordic countries are traditionally divided into two parts. If you have a sort of a historical view at the Nordic countries, we have the East tradition, which is Sweden and Finland, and then we have the West tradition, which is Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. And it's historic reasons that make up this division, but they also have a legal impact. And it's actually because Sweden and Denmark were the big sort of kingdoms in the north. So some of the other countries, I'm not proud of that, but they were part of Sweden and Denmark far back. And this also means that there are some differences between East and West, especially as regards the institutional parts of constitutional law. So Norway, Iceland, and Denmark, they have long traditions actually for constitutional review. And when I say constitutional review, I mean concrete ex post review. But it's a very new tradition in Finland and Sweden. And it's primarily actually linked to Finland's and Sweden's accession to the European Union in 1995. Especially in Finland, this is the case. But we can't view it isolated from the fact that there's a strong tradition of prior review of constitutionality of legislation, both in Finland and Sweden. So they have these very famous constitutional committees in Sweden and Finland, which perform a very, very strong prior review of the constitutionality of legislation. So in the North, we have this tradition of strong parliaments and reluctant courts. If we look at the level of court activity as regards reviewing the constitutionality of legislation, we find the most active courts in Norway and Iceland. In Iceland, it's especially since 1995. But in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, the courts are a little less active. And there must be a clear violation of the constitution in order for the Nordic courts to set aside legislation as unconstitutional. In Denmark, this has actually only happened once, and it happened in a case called the Twin Judgment, which is from 1999. Here we go. And if we then turn to the legal basis for constitutional review, we find that until 2015, the Constitution of Norway did not mention the competence of the courts to perform constitutional review of the legislation. So in Denmark, the Constitution still doesn't mention the constitutional review competence of the courts. It is performed in practice, but it's not mentioned in the constitutional text. But in both countries, the competence has a legal basis in an old, legally binding constitutional convention. The court's reluctance is actually a result of a judge-made criterion inducing self-restraint through the case law of the Supreme Courts of Norway and Denmark. So it's actually a choice, you could say, of the judges to put this reluctance, this restraint on themselves. In Finland, the constitutional review competence was written into the Finnish constitution in the year of 2000. So as you can tell, constitutional review of legislation is performed in practice. It does have a legal basis in constitutional conventions in at least Denmark and Norway, and it is slowly beginning to be put in the text of the constitutions, but it's not very visible, to be honest. And that probably reflects, in a way, at least symbolically, the reluctance of the courts. Okay. If we then return to judicial review and democracy and good governance, because that's what we are here for today, then we see that the Nordic perception of separation of power is strong parliaments and reluctant courts. And only recently, actually, general constitutional principles such as democracy and rule of law have found their way to the first provisions of the Nordic constitutions, at least some of them. This doesn't mean that we don't have democracy or rule of law. We do indeed, very strongly, and you can tell that from some of the other provisions of the constitutions. But this tradition of having these general principles in the beginning of a constitution has slowly found its way also to the Nordic countries, and it's inspired by EU law and European Union law and by the European Convention of Human Rights. But how can all of this go hand in hand with the well-functioning Nordic democracies with a high level of good governance, high level of rule of law, transparency, human rights, and very low corruption rates? I think, of course, the answer to this is of course very complex, so we can only scrape look at the surface today. But it seems that one key to actually understand this is to be found in the emotional context in the Nordic countries. For instance, the exceptionally high level of civil trust in institutions. We have one of the highest civil rates of civil trust in institutions, actually, as such, both political and courts. But there's also, in general, a trust in the Nordic societies. It's also just a general trust, I think, among people, that you trust other people, and actually also that the institutions trust the people. So the citizens' trust in public institutions, I think, is a key to understand how you can have reluctant courts and at the same time a high level of democracy and good governance. Because the people trust the institutions, the political institutions, they do not demand, for instance, to have to have stronger courts. And of course, I think it's also you could also say that the fact that good governance is actually present, it is actually being performed by political institutions, that also reinforces the civic trust. So it's kind of a circle that reinforces itself. But also other parameters of explanation could be mentioned, and I think that could be found in the fact that the Nordic countries are quite wealthy welfare states, and we have a quite high level of equality among citizens and solidarity. We distribute a lot of tax monies. We have one of the highest tax levels in the world, and we distribute a lot of this money among people who have less. So I think there's also something to find. It's possible to find an explanation here, because I think that says something about why we do not have, we have no corruption where I come from in the Nordic countries. And then the last thing I would like to mention is civic emotional education, moral feelings, and of course a strong, long and sound civil servant tradition and a healthy political culture, which is of course also factors which should be mentioned. And of course that supports a good governance tradition. So that takes me to the conclusion, because we also need to have time to discuss, and we have many other interesting papers on this panel. So the conclusion is that the constitutional systems of the Nordic countries show that active constitutional review is not a necessity for strong democracies. But I think it's also important to mention at the same time, very quickly, that the success of the Nordic case, if we can call it that, in my view, cannot directly be transplanted to other constitutional systems. Because the Nordic constitutional systems with these reluctant courts and strong parliaments seem to be well functioning, among others, because of the specific emotional context of the Nordic countries, which is built on some common Nordic moral values. Of course, it's not all happiness, and if we should talk a little about the weaknesses of this constitutional model, it would be that the weakness of the Nordic constitutional systems as regards the strong parliaments and the reluctant courts is that if the emotional landscape changes at some point, then constitutionalism might not be as strong anymore. So of course that is a weak point. Whether the courts would then step up in such a situation and start to perform a more activist constitutional review is yet to be seen. We don't know that. We'll have to wait and see if that would happen in such a situation. I just want to end by saying that that populism actually it does exist in the Nordic countries, though not to the same extent as and maybe also in a different form actually than, for instance, in Poland and Hungary. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later today about these countries. But it does exist, and who knows? Maybe at some point it might actually challenge the Nordic model of these reluctant courts and strong parliaments. And that is actually everything I have brought with me today. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Krohnke, for such an enlightening presentation. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Michael Gilbert. Professor Gilbert is Vice Dean and Professor of Law of the University of Virginia. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the universities for hosting me, and special thanks to Professor Riveri for inviting me. I have known Professor Riveri for some time, and I'm honored to be here and to spend a couple of days with all of you talking about these interesting and important topics. When I think about the relationship between emotions and constitutional law, I usually think in negative terms. I usually think that emotions are the enemy of constitutionalism. When people are consumed by emotions such as anger, or greed, or hatred, or a lust for power, they're likely to take actions that run contrary to our constitutional values, as when a military general consumed by a lust for power violates the Constitution and seizes power, or as when a religious majority consumed by hatred infringes on the rights of a minority. Many of our features of constitutional law are specifically designed to counteract exactly these negative emotions. You probably all are familiar with this. I'll just briefly mention two examples. We often enshrine rights for minorities in our constitutions, not necessarily because we worry that the majority will always violate the minority's rights, but because we worry that the majority will violate those rights when it's consumed by passions or emotions. I'll give you one more example from separate research I've done with some co-authors. We study a feature of many constitutions that we call constitutional locks. These are quite common in constitutions around the world, and they're forced waiting periods for constitutional amendments. The idea is you can propose an amendment to the Constitution today, but you have to then wait at least 90 days before you can vote on it. And the principal purpose of a constitutional lock is to tamp down people's emotions, so that you wait a while, so that you cool down before considering amending your fundamental document. So as I said, I usually think of emotions as being the enemy of constitutional law, but this very interesting conference invites us to think about the opposite idea. Can emotions be helpful or supportive to constitutional law? It seems to me that emotions surely can benefit and support constitutional values in general. So if, for example, a group of people shares a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood, they might cooperate readily with one another. And likewise, if a group of people has a sense of altruism, this might promote charity and equality among them. If a group of people has a sense of tolerance for one another, this can promote peace. And of course, peace and equality and cooperation are often thought of as important constitutional values. So there is a relationship here, but as I've described it, I think the relationship is quite indirect. These emotional states can promote constitutional values, but a constitution isn't strictly necessary for that to happen. So just to be clear, if a group of people shares a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood, they might cooperate with one another, but that's true whether they're governed by a constitution or not. And likewise, if a group of people has a sense of tolerance for one another, that can promote peace, but again, it can promote peace whether you have a constitution or not. So I think that emotions can help with constitutional values, but I want to focus the rest of my time on a more specific question, which is when and how can emotions support constitutionalism in particular? And I want to suggest that one specific emotion can promote constitutionalism through two related pathways. Now, the emotion I want to discuss is what I will call constitutional devotion. So by constitutional devotion, I mean a commitment to, an affection for, or an attachment to one's constitution, perhaps regardless of what exactly that constitution says. I think that at least in some places and sometimes, constitutional devotion is a real emotion. It's a real phenomenon. And I will give you just a couple of anecdotes from my country, the United States. When candidates for office run in elections, whether they're running for the presidency at the highest level or whether they seek to be the mayor of the town, they very frequently, among other things, will profess their commitment to the U.S. Constitution over and over. Why do they do this? Well, there are different possible explanations, but one is that I believe many of these candidates have this emotion of constitutional devotion, and the voters have this emotion, and they want to see that their elected officials share it. I'll give you one more example. Some of you might be familiar with this, others of you might be surprised. In the United States, it is not uncommon to find elected officials and government administrators and judges and lawyers and even ordinary citizens going about their days carrying their wallet and their keys in their pockets and also a miniature copy of the Constitution. It's a religion of sorts in some corners of my country. And all of this is consistent with this emotion that I will refer to as constitutional devotion. Now, as I said, I want to discuss two pathways by which I think constitutional devotion can support constitutionalism. And the first way is by countering emotions with emotion. So let me explain the idea using some recent examples from the United States. During Donald Trump's presidency, he stirred up a lot of trouble. He enraged many people in my country by stirring up their passions, their emotions. And I'll just mention two of these. Not for the first time. He convinced many American voters that Islam is a threat, that we should be fearful of Muslims. And this fear spread, and among other things, it led to a policy that we call the travel ban that for a time prohibited people from some majority Muslim countries from visiting the United States. People were consumed by a kind of anti-constitutional emotion that Donald Trump stirred up. One other example, many of you are probably familiar with this from the news. After he lost the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump claimed that the election had been stolen from him without evidence. There's no evidence to support this. But even now, almost 2 years later, something like 30% of Americans, maybe 40%, they think he might have been right, that maybe this election was stolen. They're in a kind of emotional state, an anti-constitutional emotional state that's pushing them to take actions that do not comply with our Constitution. Now, how can we counter these kinds of anti-constitutional emotions? One solution, or one approach, is with reason. This is the approach that law often takes. You are consumed by passions, but we, whether we're judges or lawyers or civic leaders, we will explain to you calmly and rationally why you shouldn't think that way, why you're being consumed by short-term interests, but in the long term you will regret these decisions you would like to make. Okay, reason is very powerful. It's an animating principle in law. But as you know, reason does not always work. Reason is hard. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes deliberation, and as all of you have experienced in your life, when you're up against a person consumed by emotions, sometimes reason doesn't help at all. Anybody who has children understands this. You can be as reasonable as possible, but if they're not in a mental state to listen to you, it doesn't help. So I want to suggest that there is another way to counter these anti-constitutional emotions, and it's with another emotion, the one that I mentioned, constitutional devotion. So the idea that I have in mind here is this: take a person who doesn't have that devotion, but who has been convinced by Donald Trump that the 2020 election was stolen. That person is consumed by emotions. They don't feel a dedication to the Constitution. They're not in a mental place to listen to reason. They might take drastic action, like marching on the US Capitol and trying to prevent the peaceful transition of power. But now imagine another person who has not one but two emotions. On the one hand, they believe the election was stolen, but on the other hand, they have constitutional devotion. They might be one of those Americans carrying a copy of the Constitution in their pocket. Now, this person might behave differently. This person might think, I believe the election was stolen and something should be done, but on the other hand, I also have a faith in the Constitution, and I know that attempting to subvert the process is not consistent with that Constitution. So one pathway by which I think an emotion can support not just constitutional values, but constitutionalism itself, is by countering other emotions. Sometimes it's easier to experience an emotion than to deal with reason. Now, I told you there are two pathways that I want to explore by which this emotion can support constitutionalism. The second one is slightly more complicated and more conceptual, and it relies on economics, which is a field of inquiry in which I specialize. I'll do my best to be clear. So to explain the idea, Well, here's the basic insight. Emotions can not only support constitutionalism, but they can do a better job of supporting constitutionalism than many other emotions, such as altruism. And to explain why, I want to ask for your patience while I talk for 2 or 3 minutes about a quite different setting. Instead of constitutions, which are complicated, I want to talk about something simple for a moment: driving. Once you see the idea in a simple context, I'll try to pick it up and apply it to constitutional law. So, a selfish person who is not governed by law is probably going to drive too fast. Why? Because a selfish person thinks about their benefit from driving quickly and not about the costs or the risks that they're imposing on pedestrians and other drivers. In the language of economics, a selfish driver is externalizing costs. The pedestrian bears those costs, but the driver doesn't pay for it, so the driver doesn't care. How can we elicit better behavior from the driver? Well, law and damages offer the usual answer. We will make the driver pay for any harm that she causes to the pedestrian. Well, as soon as the driver has to pay damages, those costs are no longer external, they're internal. Now the driver has to think not only about her benefit from driving quickly, but also the damages that she has to pay in the event of an accident. Or to put it differently, with damages, the driver's considering all the costs and benefits of her behavior, not just her own, and this improves her incentives. Okay, so law functions in this way. Now here's the question. What if, instead of law, we just changed the driver's mental state? What if you waved a magic wand and you turned the driver who was selfish into a driver who is empathetic or altruistic, so that the driver, in the event of an accident, feels bad? The driver has a negative emotional response. The driver regrets harming the pedestrian. Okay, this driver sounds like a better person. Now, here's the question. Just by changing this driver's emotions, is that enough to elicit optimal driving? Or do we still need law? Do we still need damages? The answer is, we still need law. Just changing the person's mental state doesn't do all the work that we need. Let me explain the idea. The selfish driver has one thought in mind: right? How fast I go. The selfish driver who's subject to damages has two thoughts in mind: how fast I go and whether I have to pay any money. Now let's think about the driver whose emotions I have changed, who's empathetic. Okay, this driver might think, well, I worry about how fast I go, and I worry about my own psychological state. If I cause an accident, I will feel bad. What about the actual harm to the pedestrian? My emotional feelings about harming you is distinct from the actual broken leg that you suffer in the event of an accident. To get the driver to behave correctly, it's not enough for the driver to think about her benefits from driving and her emotional state. She also has to think about the actual harm she's imposing on the pedestrian. And how do we get the driver to do that? Make her pay damages. Okay, I'm almost done talking about driving, I promise. Let's just make one more change now to the little scenario I've described. What if we didn't make the driver empathetic? We didn't change the emotional state in that way. Instead, what we did was wave a magic wand and make the driver emotionally attached to the law on driving. So now the driver doesn't feel bad about causing an accident. The driver feels bad about not meeting the legal standard. She feels bad about not going the proper speed. Well, this emotion is much more effective. This emotion, this attachment to the law, not the pedestrian, pushes the driver to go at exactly the right speed that the law mandates. And that's what we want. Okay, now let's pick up this idea and come back to constitutional law just for a minute or two. Let's think, I gave you an example earlier, let's think about the religious majority that is consumed by passions and wants to infringe on the rights of a religious minority. How can we prevent this from happening? Well, one solution might be to try to change the emotional state of that religious majority so that they become empathetic or altruistic. Now the religious majority not only thinks about their own religion, say, but they think about the harm that their action would cause to the minority. This is just like the driver, who now has an emotional response to harming the pedestrian. Does changing the religious majority's emotion in this way elicit the proper behavior from the majority? No, for the same reason. The religious majority worries about its own benefits, of course, and now it worries about its emotional costs or sensitivities, but there's still another harm out there, the actual harm that that majority's activity is causing to the minority. To get that harm taken into account, we still need law. We still need constitutional law that says to the majority, you can't do this. Now, if constitutional law were easy to enforce all of the time, that would work well. But of course it isn't. Enforcing constitutional law is often difficult. Okay, so what's another solution to this? Instead of making the religious majority empathetic or altruistic towards the minority, we could try to create in the religious majority a different emotion, constitutional devotion. If the majority is not committed, say, to the minority, but is instead devoted to upholding the Constitution, so that they themselves suffer an emotional cost if they don't uphold or behave consistently with the Constitution, then they're much more likely to do what the Constitution requires. So constitutional devotion can actually elicit, I believe, a better response, one more consistent with the values we care about, than other emotions such as altruism or empathy or other arguments like that. And I'll stop there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Gilbert, for your presentation and for honoring the timing. Our next speaker, our final speaker, will be Paolo Riveri. I will not introduce Pablo again. You know who he is. So Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much, Hele and Mike. I will try to push forward some ideas I've been developing in Spanish. I'm writing a book on constitutional theory. And one chapter, this is the one we were discussing with Helen some time ago, deals with the constitutional sentiments, with political passions, and emotions as well. So I will try to rush through a couple of items and things that are important to debate, and perhaps I will tap on something Professor Gilbert has just raised. But on top of that, I think this is very important, I will try to share some grasps, some instincts I have concerning which emotions are particularly relevant in Latin America, in Global South, but particularly here in countries like Argentina, because I dare to say that for most of us, we think that something is going wrong, that this democratic downfall and the backsliding of institutional proceedings and the way we behave has something to do with our emotional state of mind, and I think this is key. So, the crisis of political representation, the idea that there is a crisis as well here of the authority of the law. Antonio always reflects on Nino's idea of un país al margen de la ley. I think it is very close related with at least three important or key emotions that should be fostered for the future. Firstly, my guess is that it is important to think about collective shame. Secondly, I think we must think about and all satellites emotions that's hovering around these concepts. The idea of a grounded hope, and thirdly, with the idea of truthfulness. For instance, while we are seated comfortably at home watching TV and we see these images of the war in Ukraine, corpses, people dead, destruction, massive destruction, and we are just clicking, and watching all these dreadful images. There's no connection with the way we feel we should react as regards with some emotion like shame. Secondly, when we read a book, or if any of you have seen this wonderful movie on the Churchill's final speech, asking for blood, toil, tears and sweat. The authority of this man, his leadership, has something to do with hope. Which kind of hope? This is my question. Because we are also always thinking in wishful areas and fields in our lives we would like to accomplish or to have. And what about truthfulness? Our president, in the midst of the pandemic, was pictured in a party at home like Boris Johnson. So people were isolated, compellingly they were isolated at home, and some guys were having a party. And these guys are supposed to be our leaders. You have to think about how to trace back those emotions and this clear-cut distinction between what Professor Gilbert have just pointed out as, emotions as the opposite of reason. I would like to go back, look backwards, and something I like very much, which are the Greek tradition, the classical Greek tradition. And the first thing I thought was the oldest poem in Western civilization, which is both the Iliad and the Odyssey. The first book, as you know, is the story of Achilles, the wrath of Achilles. Pure emotion that caused a lot of death and was the principal reason why Greeks had to struggle during 10 years to finally overcome the walls of Troy and destroy their enemies. But was the core of the story was this sad death of Patroclo and how the guilt ashamed, in a sense, Achilles. The second book, the Odyssey, it's not a pathetic book based on emotion, but rather it's the canon of Odyssey, how he used all the mind resources he had in order to lead all the sailors back home to Ithaca, to find Penelope, Telemaco, and the dog Argos that was waiting there. So decision making, it's key issue in this ancient tradition, which is also a key element in Plato and Aristotle. Particularly if we think about the Phaedrus, this idea of the chariot, you know about that, the black winged horse and the white winged horse. One depicts reason, and one depicts the bad impulses, the bad emotions, the ill emotions, whereas the other, it's the enlightened one. The charioteer That's the reason. They have to tame, they have to cope, to grapple with these emotions. Aristotle does not think likewise, and he believes that we can educate, hexis proiatike, we can endeavor, and with practice in the long run, we will develop both Dialectics virtues as well as intellectual virtues. So, having said this, I don't want to go through what happened with the contractarian tradition and modern times. Chief Justice Rosati have developed some of these ideas. But still, I mean, in the origin of constitutionalism, if you read, for instance, the Federalist Papers, Publius particularly, this is the idea that reason, reflect on reason, Federalist Paper number 1, based on choice and reflection, we can engineer something to prevent bad outcomes to appear. So, I've chosen here a couple of stories, small, little, short ones, to tell you, for instance, based upon what Plato tells us in Book 4 of the Republic, something that happened once upon a time in Athens. And this is textual. Leontius, the son of Aglaon, as he came up from the Piraeus on the outside of the northern wall, saw the executioner with some corpus lying near him. Leontius felt a strong desire to look at them. But at the same time, he was disgusted and turned away. For a time, he struggled with himself and covered his face, but then, overcome by his desire, forcing his eyes wide open and rushing toward the corpus, he said, "You evil things, get your fill of the beautiful sight." This is the spectacle of death. The spectacle that happened, for instance, after the French Revolution we were talking before. And of course, to my knowledge, it looks like there is a kind of shamelessly attitude toward the tragedy, toward these awful and dreadful images. Let's go to a second portrait or picture that is always based upon several hundred years ago. And this is the story about the Peloponnesian War and what was the siege of Melos. And according to Thucydides, this unsentimental historian describes in this story, in the book, what happened with the conversation, the dialogue, the negotiations before the Athenians assaulted the island. So the millions express that this is about hope, that the Spartans will come to rescue them, while the Athenians calmly point out that it would be extremely dangerous for the Spartans to undertake, and this is very unlikely that it would happen. And they say, and this is also textual, "We are masters of the sea. The Spartans have a formidable land forces, but we are not much, they are not much in the Athenian navy." The Melians plead that if they were convinced that they still have hope, they do not want to give up their hope. And the Athenians reply that indeed, true is that hope is a great comfort, but often a delusive one. And they add, learn what hope is when it fails, because hope is prodigal by nature. And this is a Weberian kind of remark. It says, do not act like ordinary people, it says to these leaders. And then, in the end, after when the conversations came to a final point, the Athenians withdraw and leave the millions to consider the final position. And they got the following reply. They say that they will trust in the fortunes of gods. In a final statement, they said, you have staked everything on your trust in hope, and you will ruin everything. The story, as Thucydides narrates, in the end, after some battles, the Athenians lose patience, and in the end, they kill all men and enslave women and children. So the core issue that it is presented here, and this is an important, interesting philosophy professor named Critchley develops this idea, which is also grounded in the Greek tradition, the classical thought. And remember the myth of Pandora, that there is nothing worse than false hope. You know, to have an ungrounded hope. And I think this is very important for a polity, for a political community, for a democracy, to encourage and to flesh out our deliberations in order to build up hope. Not any hope. We must be very confident about our the way we address things and the way we grapple with huge challenges as the one the millions have faced. And finally, I will go very fast because I don't want to take more time. I was thinking about truthfulness, we were talking before, and there is also a very interesting passage brought by Thucydides after the Sicilian failure in the military campaign of Nicias. And it is very interesting that this is brought by two important authors. I share, if you are interested about that, Bernard Williams and Leo Strauss went for the very same story. How the way Nicias defended himself when, everybody was claiming for accountability after the military disaster. And in a sense, he presented himself acknowledging that he had done some wrong things, but in the end that he has this kind of honor. And by acknowledging that something is wrong, Thucydides, very far away, as an observer, not taking part of the story, somehow I think agrees with the Nicias argument. So, and I want to wrap it all, my guess is this is absolutely very rewarding, very interesting. We have so many things and profiles to explore. And my idea is that if we can somehow connect these basic elements like grounded hope, think about truthfulness, veracity. It's not just a collection of truth, like a forecast that always says accurately what is going to happen tomorrow with weather. the persons that wants to convey truth, to speak, knowing what he's saying and trying to portray, as I said, a fair picture of the problems, a politician, whoever, a judge. I think that would foster more reliable outcomes. So truthfulness is key, as well as to work out grounds for have hope, but doing something about that. Not what happened here, that we have populist narratives that are always promising something that is absolutely never to happen. This is the sad story of our country in the last 40, 50 years, perhaps, or more. And as I said, I would like to wrap it all, finish by thinking of, share some thoughts on shame as well. Professor Shayo, for instance, connects the idea of shame with respect and also with reconciliation. We have been undergoing rough, very difficult times. We've been, with a lot of violence. Think about shame. Those military, those people that are engaged in corruption. Well, it is fundamental to try to make these emotions and feelings thrive. So it is not just, and this is my connection with Professor Gilbert's presentation. It is important, to build up the idea of the importance of the rule of law and to have this devotion towards law, but it is, for my understanding, very important to give grounds to that. So, thinking about that and thinking about time, just, I finish. I will read a poem linking these ideas that was written by Pindar, and I took it from Bernard Williams' book. It is beautiful. And it deals somehow with the idea of self-awareness. And it says, take to heart what may be learned from Oedipus. If someone with a sharp axe hacks off the boughs of a great oak tree and spoil its handsome shape, although its fruit has failed, yet it can give an account of itself. If it comes later to a winter fire, or if it rests on the pillars of some palace, and thus a sad task among foreigner walls, when there is nothing left in the place it came from. Fini. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for reminding us the wisdom that we always find in the classics. So we have now 30 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, we have many hands. That's fine. You want to start?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your three very interesting presentations. I enjoyed all of them. I learned a lot from all of them. But my question is directed to Mike Gilbert and the constitutional devotion. And I've two questions. And the first one is the difference between the traffic example that you gave and the Constitution, of course, is that a traffic sign is pretty obvious, while the Constitution or the interpretation of the Constitution can be quite contested. And that's probably a reason why even Trump doesn't say he is not on the basis of the Constitution, but he finds some obscure lawyer who tells him that it's fine for Mike Trump not to certify the election result. And doesn't the one emotion that we have, the anger about the stolen election, then let us choose the interpretation of the Constitution so that constitutional devotion doesn't really come into play, because we make it consistent that basically our interpretation that fits with our one emotion also fits with our other emotion, the constitutional devotion. And the second question goes into a similar direction, and that's whether. Yeah, I think I leave it at the first question. I think that's fine.
Thank you very. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I think you make excellent points, and in a slightly longer presentation.
Mike.
I need to hold it closer. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Niels, for the excellent questions. If I had had a little more time in my presentation, I would have said a little bit about exactly your concerns. So you picked up immediately on weakness in analogizing from driving to constitutions. And of course, I recognize this. So just a couple of comments to make about this. I think that the emotion of constitutional devotion through both of the pathways that I mentioned surely is most effective when the meaning of the Constitution is clear. And sometimes it is clear, though not always, and not always in the most important areas. So for example, the US Constitution states very clearly that you can't be president for more than 2 terms. And I feel very confident that not just the law, but the sense of devotion to the Constitution would cause Americans across the spectrum to resist any effort to stay on for a 3rd term. And the emotion works most effectively when the document is clear. I agree with you. Many of the most important areas are ones where a constitutional law, contested areas, the meaning is not clear and we have different interpretations. And in those situations, I think constitutional devotion, for exactly the reasons you say, could backfire. Right? So if you have 2 groups of people who both have a strong devotion to the Constitution, and the first group understands the Constitution to mean A, and the second group understands it to mean the opposite of A, then this emotion can make the conflict worse rather than better. I think that's exactly right. So maybe a way to put it is that under certain conditions, constitutional devotion can promote constitutionalism, but those conditions do not always hold. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for 3 of them for this wonderful presentation. I have a question for Professor Chilban. You said that when you talk about the constitutional devotion, you said that there is a sentiment to uphold the Constitution, but it seems that you are thinking more about upholding liberal or Republican values, or at least you need to tell us what do you think it is a constitution or constitutionalism in order to say that constitutional devotion is something we need to develop constitution. Otherwise, I'm thinking about authoritarian countries that have a constitution, and probably most people or some people have a constitutional devotion to that constitution, but it seems that from your presentation, you won't say that that would help us to create a better country, a system with constitutionalism.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a response, but if it's not satisfactory, I'm not sure I understood everything. We can follow up. We can follow up afterwards. So, just to be clear, it is not my position that constitutional devotion is necessary for the functioning of a constitution and constitutionalism. It's just one method by which a certain emotion can support constitutionalism. And as the last question made clear, this is not a universal argument. It's under certain conditions. This kind of emotion could be quite helpful. Just to say a little more, as I've developed it so far, I have only what I'll call a thin conception of constitutional devotion. So what I mean by that is the emotion is a kind of dedication to upholding the Constitution insofar, again related to the last question, its meaning and its commands are clear. And that's all. So what constitutional devotion means when the proper interpretation of the document is unclear, I don't really know. I have just a thin conception of it. But I think even that thin conception could be quite helpful, and I'll just reiterate the example I gave. In the United States, it is possible, it's a big stretch, but it's possible to claim that the Vice President has some authority under the law, including under the Constitution, not to count certain electoral college votes. This was part of a legal controversy around the 2020 election. The document's not clear on this, and neither is the statute. We all know the right answer as a matter of morality, but the document's not clear. But as I said before, on the question of whether, for example, Donald Trump could run for 3 terms, I think it's clear. The answer is no, and I don't think even his most fervent supporters would think otherwise. And that's not just because they feel bound by the specific text of the law. They have this emotional attachment to doing what the document says. I hope that helps a little.
Before Pedro, Ricardo has a questions. He doesn't need a mic. We know that. Okay.
Hello. Okay, my question is for Helle Krumke. Do you think that the reluctance to judicial review is not the consequence of having a strong democracy and not the other way around, so that you have a strong democracy because you have a reluctance to judicial review? Because if you look at the French, they also have a strong reluctance to judicial review, and if you look at the history of France, you wouldn't say that they always had a strong attachment to democracy. Of course, you could say, well, Germany, they have a strong judicial review and they have a strong attachment to democracy. Yes, but they had a difficult history, I would say. So would you say that this is because actually you don't need a strong judicial review in Nordic countries?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Somehow I had guessed already when I wrote my paper that I would get this question. And I think I also maybe partly replied to it during my presentation, because I said that this is, of course, reinforcing also itself. I mean, obviously, if you live in a country where, at least we hope, there's good governance and democracy present, then it enforces also the trust, and it becomes this positive circle in a way. So of course that partly, I think, answers your question. Yes, I think it goes hand in hand. And I also ask myself about the hen and the egg while writing this paper. But then again, I mean, Denmark has not always been a democracy when you think about it. And I mean, we did have a king once who ruled the realm and decided everything, and there was no separation of powers, and there was no real democracy. And I think the first constitution in Denmark from 1949, only 6%, for instance, of the citizens had the right to vote. So that would be, of course, the rich male citizens, put very, So we get the real democracy in I would say around 1915 in a way, because there you also the group that can vote and so forth is extended, and the powers of the king are diminished. This is not something that happens from one day to the other. We have an evolutionary constitution, and therefore since 1849 the power of the monarchs sort of became less and less. It wasn't ideal from the beginning. And I think that while I'm talking about this is because I think it's interesting in relation to what you're saying, because it's actually in the 1920s that the courts start defining this right for themselves to review legislation in relation to the Constitution. So it's actually at a point in history where democracy is becoming stronger, I would say, is actually reaching its final point in a way. And I don't know whether it makes sense for you what I'm saying, but I think that is in a way quite interesting if you look at the timeline somehow. And then I didn't get the last question. You said something whether I think it is a precondition. No, that is it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pedro?
Well, thank you all for your expositions. It was good food for thought. I have a question for Professor Krunke. It's just to know a little more about the operation of the Nordic country systems. In countries with strong judicial review, we also usually have a strong culture of public interest litigation. We have organizations that, like the ACLU in the United States, that have as one of their aims litigation for promoting human rights and different kind of public interest issues. Is there something similar in your countries, or this activity is completely inexistent? How human rights activism is channeled in the northern countries? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I almost said especially very happy also for this question you are asking, also because it gives me a chance to say that everything is not ideal in the Nordic countries, and that was not my point either. You know, sometimes you synthesize things a little when you do a presentation, and it had to fit into this wonderful theme by Pablo. But let's be a little more nuanced. Well, first of all, the truth is really that the Human Rights Charter we have in Denmark, for instance, because this is where I come from, it is actually almost the same as in 1849, which I find very interesting in a way. If you look at the other Nordic countries, they have been a bit more sensible, and they have actually managed to modernize, I would call it, their human rights charters, and to streamline them a bit more with modern human rights perceptions and new rights, digital rights, rights of nature. More sort of, I would say, more. For instance, where I come from, gender equality is a very important value, important right, but it's actually not present in the Constitution. I think that would surprise many people, because I think I come from the part of the world, maybe with most gender equality. It's a deep value, but it's not present in a Constitution from 1849. So I guess, but in the other Nordic countries, they have actually managed to I would say, update the Human Rights Charter much more. And then, of course, then in a country like Denmark, where we just don't change the Constitution very often, we did that in 1953 the last time, the European Convention of Human Rights becomes very, very important. So it actually ends up in court that it's, I wouldn't say normally, but very often the living document within human rights, that's the European Convention of Human Rights. And then you would think, I agree with you, that you had all these organizations fighting for human rights and so forth. I don't think we have a very strong tradition, actually, of that, to be honest, at least not as strong as the examples you mentioned. And then my very last comment, because I want to tear down the ideal little society I have told you about. I think where we have the most problem is really human rights as regards refugees and asylum seekers, and I'm so sorry to say that I think Denmark has built up from having a very good international reputation, has really torn down, I think, parts of our reputation the past 2 decades. I'm not proud of that. Thank you.
My question goes to Michael Gilbert. First of all, congratulations. Really, it's very provoking, this idea of constitutionalism, constitutional devotion. You know, I'm an old constitutional professor. From the beginning of my career, I used to go to your constitutional continuity to find out really what should be. But after Trump, it was very disappointing, because it happened exactly the opposite, particularly with the Congress as such. In my opinion, a kind of small coup d'etat, which was very much alike to the República Bananera. I don't know where you can understand this expression. So, to make something short, is constitutional devotion still alive in your country after Trump? And taking in account that from what I have read the last days, probably he will win again next year, the presidency, not the popular vote.
Well, he might win the presidency if he's not in prison. So it's a very good question, and I can only speculate on an answer, but my own opinion is that constitutionalism and constitutional devotion is alive and well in the United States. And I actually think, as terrible and embarrassing as the assault on the Capitol was in January 2021, it was actually evidence for this proposition. An enormous number of people in my country, particularly at that time, seemed truly to believe that the election had been stolen. It turns out they had no basis for believing this. There have been many investigations and many recounts. There's nothing there to see. But an enormous number of people truly believed it and believed it strongly. Only a very, very, very small number showed up at the Capitol that day to try to take extra legal action in light of this. Now, there's more than one potential explanation for why they didn't show up. One, of course, is many people can't afford the plane ticket to Washington. But I think among the explanations, one is that many people had a sense of constitutional devotion or a kind of commitment to the Constitution and law generally that led them to believe that whatever the proper solution is to what they perceived as a stolen election, it's not to march on the Capitol and to break things and to burn things. I'll say one other point about this. There were over 60 court cases. There were recounts and investigations and so on, but there were over 60 court cases in both state and federal courts about the 2020 election. And it was very interesting to observe these cases for multiple reasons. One reason was that on the steps of the courthouse, the lawyers for Donald Trump said things like, the election has been stolen. But the moment they walked into the courthouse, they didn't say that. Because once you're in the courthouse, you do not have the freedom of speech. If you say things to the judge for which you have no evidence and that you can't back up, you can get in big trouble. So once the lawyers were actually in the courthouse, they said things like, well, the observers for the election were forced to stand 6 feet away during the counting of the ballots instead of 4 feet away. Okay. These are trivial matters. The other interesting thing is that across the board, he lost these cases. Over 60 of them. In state courts, in federal courts, high courts, low courts. The Supreme Court refused to hear some of this. Judges on the federal courts that Trump himself appointed to the bench, they rejected these claims out of hand. So this is, I think, further evidence for the proposition that this was a terrible episode in my history and ugly, but I don't think yet there's a reason to believe that U.S. constitutionalism is on the decline. I think there were many promising signs connected to that event.
Professor Vatauros.
Well, thank you very much. Great presentations. I have a small question for Dr. Helen Kronke. Mange tack for your presentation. And it seems that education has a huge impact on this kind of structure for Nordic exceptionalism. Okay, but don't you think that immigration and in the following years more diversity will introduce more conflict and then diminish the reluctance to apply judicial review? Do you think that this specific factor will make an impact on the Nordic exceptionalism?
Thank you very much. Another great question. I hope I understood it right. Otherwise, please let me know, because you bring to the table the concept of diversity, and if I understood your question right, I think it's really good, because the problem is, of course, that in a society where everyone look alike, think alike, are very much alike, it's so much easier to have all this solidarity, which it is in a way, I guess. It's also a very small country, so it makes it easier too. And you are absolutely right that this is part of what could be the challenge, I think, in the future, that there will be more diversity. There already is, of course, more diversity in the society than there was, for instance, in the 1950s. And that's also why I mentioned the asylum seekers and the refugees and people coming to Denmark with other religions, obviously, than Christianity. And yeah, you are quite right, and that also has to do with populism, and yeah, it goes hand in hand. And I absolutely agree with you that, of course, this could be challenges in the future. I still think, I hope, I believe that I think it will probably still be a society with I think which attaches a great importance, I think, to constitutionalism, and I think that also because I think that part of the success, if you can call it, is actually sort of the education of children in schools and everything, that you kind of learn children from a very, very early stage about these very common values. It actually says that in the legislation on the schools, that you have to teach them about democracy and gender equality and sort of tolerance in a way towards others, and to learn to share in school with other children. So I do believe it is some values at a deeper level in the Nordic countries. But I agree with you that if there is a threat, something that could sort of trigger something, this is exactly the diversity issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I have a question about Professor Gilbert, if I may. How can you instill constitutional devotion in the people without promising too much about what to expect from the Constitution? In other words, how can you instill constitutional devotion to address constitutional frustration when things do not work the way it should?
I don't know. So this is an excellent question. And in a sense, a foundational question. My defense in saying I don't know is that, as you maybe noticed in my presentation, I assumed that just by, like Harry Potter, you just wave a wand and you can change a person's mental state. And the reason I started there is because I'm interested in exploring whether and when and how changing people's mental states can actually improve constitutional law or their adherence to law. And I think there are many interesting things to say here. As I suggested in the very simple driving example, simply making a person feel bad about others doesn't do the work. So there are many complications to explore here. And so far I'm focused just on those complications. If and when I ever make confident conclusions that, oh, well, this particular emotion really can, under these conditions, improve matters, it seems to me then the question of how do you inculcate that emotion becomes ripe. And this might be a matter for psychologists and sociologists and be far outside of my scope.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, sure. Should.
If there's still time, I have a question for Professor Riveri. And my question is going to make me sound cruel and cold-hearted. It's about your notion of collective shame. So I understand you to be arguing that it could be beneficial for constitutional law and for constitutional values to inculcate in all of us a sense of shame, so that when we see atrocities like the war in Ukraine, we have an emotional experience in reaction to that. And so let's just wave the wand again and suppose that we inculcate this collective shame. I can imagine two roads leading from this point. On one road, our sense of collective shame leads us to take collective action, and we make serious efforts to stop these atrocities, and that would be good. But the other possibility is that we don't take any collective action, and we just all feel worse than we did before. And it's that second possibility that I want to ask you about. We have so many emotions and challenges in the world, and adding shame about every terrible thing could weigh very heavily on people's conscience. And if no collective action results from it, is this a good?
It's a tough one, very tough one. I would say in two steps, which are my reaction to your question, trying to stress something which is important to my knowledge. That when I'm addressing this idea of collective shame, of course it's something fussy, because the notion of shame is something that is individual experience. So this is a kind of path or shortcut in order to depict collective values that have been impaired because of humans' behavior, human conduct. So my guess is that we are usually now reacting according to our individual and selfish interests. So going back to your example, something that we've been talking before, if there is different kind of character, moral character as altruistic and selfish people, the key problem in the crisis we try to portray is that now altruistic people, cooperation, this idea of fraternité or solidarity is not coming along. And here I think it's something which is also interesting, that it's also raised by Bernard Williams, that we usually misrepresent or we misunderstand the difference between guilt and shame. When we're talking about shame, I think, at least as far as I understood or can figure out, is something that goes, underneath, something different. You can feel guilty because you are declared guilty, but to feel ashamed implies that there are some emotions in your community that have been shared, and you think that you deserve to feel bad, to feel lousy because what happened. Well, this is more or less my reaction to your question. This is, I would say, the second step mingled with the first step. So if there is something still I can go forward. It's okay. May I say something a bit?
Sure.
Perhaps we have time? Yes. No.
We have
2 minutes.
2 more minutes.
No.
We want to have lunch.
I was thinking when you're talking about the reason why to abide by the Constitution and about this notion of devotion, in two main reactions, very meaningful. One is the one that was raised by Rousseau. He says, we bow under the law because we don't want to kneel down. And because the Constitution is also advice for peaceful arrangement. This is the reason why I was thinking that behind the idea of promoting and fostering and fleshing out some kind of emotion, it's very likely that these values of constitutionalism are going to thrive.
Perfect. Thank you, Paolo. I will have the last question then. I will use the chair to make the last question. And it's for Professor Krunke. You mentioned in your presentation that judicial review has a legal basis on a binding constitutional convention. I was curious about, what is that? Can you please elaborate a little bit about that binding constitutional convention?
I surely can, and I don't think these exist in that many countries, so I do understand your question and why you're wondering. But in the Danish constitutional order, constitutional conventions, I think most countries have them. That's very normal. And very often, like in the British legal system, it will be politically binding conventions in a way. But actually, in the Danish constitutional system, we do have legally binding constitutional conventions. And in order for a practice, a political practice, for instance, to become a binding constitutional convention, it has to fulfill some certain criteria, which are actually very much alike the criteria you find in British constitutional law for constitutional conventions. But the difference is that if these criteria are fulfilled, then it is a constitutional binding convention. And then it will actually be at the constitutional level, so you could say that the constitutional norms are both the norms you find in the written text, but it's also these norms which are the binding constitutional conventions. And this is not something that happens every day. It's very few of these conventions that are actually seen as legally binding constitutional conventions, of which, of course, one of the most important is the one on constitutional review. And this means that this is not something that can just be changed. This would take, for instance, it could be a change of the constitution or something in order to change it. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Krunke. And with this response, we finish this second session of this roundtable. We're going to have lunch, and we reconvene at 5 o'clock sharp. Thank you.